Hi, I'm Ethan. At his own 60th birthday party, surrounded by dozens of his most influential friends, my father laughed in my face when I told him I was joining the U.S. Army. It wasn't a quiet chuckle. It was a loud, dismissive roar that filled the entire ballroom and made every head turn in my direction. That sound, more than any insult he'd ever thrown at me, broke something inside me for good. It was the moment I realized I was truly and completely alone in the world he had built. Have you ever felt so small in your own home that you just wanted to disappear? Before I tell you exactly what he said, the words that still echo in my mind all these years later, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when a son who has been invisible his whole life finally decides to be seen. The conflict between us wasn't new. It was the foundation of our family. My father, Richard Miller, was a titan of industry, a man who measured life in stock prices and corporate takeovers. He lived in a world of sharp suits, cold handshakes, and absolute control. His heir apparent was my older brother Michael, a carbon copy of him in every way. Michael had the right degree from the right university, the right ambition, and the right car, a brand new Mercedes-Benz S-Class, just like our father's. They even wore matching Rolex watches, a silent symbol of their club. And then there was me, the artistic son, the quiet one, the disappointment. My car was a 10-year-old sedan that sputtered every time I started it, a constant rolling reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Our home in Greenwich, Connecticut, wasn't a home. It was a monument to my father's success, a massive cold stone mansion that felt more like a corporate headquarters than a place to live. Every room was perfectly decorated, sterile, and untouched. My own room was the smallest in the house, tucked away at the end of a long hallway almost like an afterthought. It was the only space that felt remotely mine, filled with my books, my sketches, and the smell of charcoal and turpentine. But even there I felt like a guest, a temporary resident in a life that didn't belong to me. The silence in that house was deafening, a heavy blanket of unspoken expectations and quiet judgments that I could never seem to escape from. It was a place where love was conditional, and I had never met the conditions. My father's disappointment in me was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of my life. He saw my passion for art not as a talent, but as a character flaw, a sign of weakness. I remember once, when I was about 16, I spent weeks on a painting, a landscape of the woods behind our house. I was proud of it, and naively thought it might finally earn a nod of approval. I showed it to him in his study, a room paneled in dark wood that always smelled of leather and money. He barely glanced up from his paperwork, looked at the canvas for a second, and just sighed. He didn't say a word, but that sigh said everything. It said, "This is what you're wasting your time on. This is all you have to offer?" It was a quiet daily erosion of my self-worth. Michael never went out of his way to be cruel, but his indifference was its own kind of pain. He was my father's son, through and through. Dinners were the worst. The three of them would sit at the long mahogany table, discussing business strategies, interest rates, and market trends. I would just sit there, a ghost at my own family's table, with nothing to contribute to their world. They didn't ask about my life, my art, or my thoughts, and I eventually learned not to offer them. Michael's success was a constant unspoken comparison. He was the son who did everything right, who fit the mold perfectly. His presence made my own perceived failures feel even more pronounced, a shadow I couldn't step out of no matter how hard I tried. My mother, Susan, was the silent casualty in all of this. I know she loved me, but she was trapped in my father's orbit, powerless to change the dynamics he had created. Her support came in quiet, fleeting moments, a gentle squeeze of my hand when my father wasn't looking, a sad, knowing smile from across the room, a plate of my favorite cookies left on my nightstand. She never stood up to him, never defended me out loud. I used to resent her for her silence, but as I got older I started to see the fear in her eyes. She was just as much a victim of his domineering nature as I was. Her quiet gestures were all she had to give, a faint signal of love from a world where she too felt invisible and unheard. The car was more than just a car. It was a public statement. Every morning I would walk out of our palatial home, past the gleaming black sedans in the driveway, and get into my dented, decade-old vehicle. The contrast was humiliating. It was a clear, calculated message from my father. This is your value. This is what you are worth. My brother got a new luxury car for his 21st birthday. I got the keys to a hand-me-down. It wasn't about the money. He could have bought 100 cars without noticing the expense. It was about control. It was about making sure I never forgot my place, that I was the lesser son, the one who didn't quite measure up to the family name. It was a daily dose of shame before I even left the driveway. The decision to join the army didn't come out of nowhere. It was born from years of feeling directionless and insignificant. I looked at my life and saw nothing that was truly mine. My home, my education, even my future felt like it was dictated by my father's wealth and his crushing expectations. The military seemed like the one place on earth where his name and his money meant absolutely nothing. It was a world built on merit, discipline, and a code of honor that had nothing to do with a bank account. It was a chance to build an identity from the ground up, to earn respect on my own terms, to finally become a man he couldn't control or dismiss. It was my last desperate attempt to find a purpose that was entirely my own. So on the night of his 60th birthday, I decided to tell them. The party was in full swing, a lavish affair held in a grand ballroom at a country club. The room was filled with the sounds of clinking champagne glasses and the low hum of powerful people making powerful connections. My father was at the center of it all, holding court, laughing, soaking in the admiration. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt a strange mix of terror and resolve. This was it. This was the moment I would finally declare my independence. I waited for a lull in the conversation, took a deep breath, and walked toward the center of the room, completely unaware that I was about to walk into the single most humiliating moment of my entire life. Threaded my way through clusters of men in tailored suits and women adorned with jewels that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. Each step felt heavier than the last. My own suit, the only one I owned, felt cheap and ill-fitting in this sea of bespoke perfection. I finally reached the circle where my father stood, a glass of what was probably $100 a bottle scotch in his hand. He was in his element, the king in his court. I waited for a pause, my throat dry, and then I said his name. Dad. He turned, a magnanimous, slightly impatient smile on his face, the kind he reserved for underlings with minor problems. Yes, Ethan, what is it? Make it quick, son. I was just telling Mr. Henderson about our new acquisition. The small group of his associates turned their attention to me, their eyes vaguely curious. This was it. There was no backing down now. I took a shallow breath, trying to keep my voice steady, and said the words I had practiced in my head 100 times. I just wanted to tell you, I've made a decision about my future. I'm enlisting. I'm joining the army. The words hung in the air for a moment, thick and strange amidst the talk of stock options and mergers. For a split second I saw a flicker of genuine confusion on my father's face. He looked at me as if I had just started speaking a foreign language, his smile faltering as he tried to process what I'd said. It was a silence that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then it began. A low chuckle started deep in his chest, a rumbling sound that grew until it erupted into a full-throated, booming laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy or amusement. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated ridicule. It was loud, dismissive, and utterly contemptuous. The sound sliced through the sophisticated chatter of the ballroom, and heads began to turn in our direction. He threw his head back, his face red with the force of his laughter, and I just stood there, frozen. Every eye in that part of the room was on me, and I felt myself shrinking under their collective gaze, my entire existence being reduced to a punchline that I didn't understand. It was the most alone I had ever felt in my life, surrounded by 100 people. He finally wiped a tear of mirth from his eye, still chuckling, and turned to the men around him, gesturing at me with his glass as if presenting a bizarre circus act. "Can you believe it?" he roared, his voice carrying across the polished floor. "My son, the artist, is joining the army." He let that sink in, letting his audience savor the absurdity. Then he looked directly at me, the laughter gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard glint of disdain. "What a waste of time," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You won't last a week in there. That's for people with no other prospects in life." The words hit me like a physical blow, each one a perfectly aimed stone, designed to shatter what little confidence I had left. A wave of sycophantic laughter rippled through his circle of friends. They were men who owed their careers to my father, men who would laugh at anything he said, no matter how cruel. They smiled and shook their heads, some patting my father on the back as if he'd just told the funniest joke of the year. No one looked at me with sympathy. A few of them shot me glances filled with a mixture of pity and contempt, the kind you give to a broken piece of furniture that's about to be thrown out. I was a momentary diversion, a brief amusing anecdote in their evening of self-congratulation. In their world I was nothing, and my father had just confirmed it for everyone to hear. My face was on fire. I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks, a hot, prickling wave of shame that threatened to suffocate me. The entire ballroom seemed to tilt, the sounds blurring into a dull roar in my ears. All I could see was my father's mocking face, his lips curled into a smirk of triumph. It was in that exact moment that I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, cold snap. The part of me that had spent 22 years desperately craving his approval, the part that flinched at his every criticism, just died. It withered and turned to dust, and in its place something else began to form, something hard and cold and resolute. The hurt was still there, but it was being rapidly encased in ice. My eyes darted to my brother, Michael, who was standing just behind my father. I was searching for anything, a look of support, a subtle shake of the head, even a flicker of shared embarrassment. I found nothing. He just stood there, swirling the ice in his glass, his gaze fixed on the floor. He wore a mask of polite indifference, the same one he always wore when our father was on a tirade. He was a bystander to my execution, and his silence was a form of consent. It was a quiet confirmation that he stood with our father on the side of power and ridicule. In his inaction, he chose his side, and it wasn't mine. That betrayal, in its own quiet way, hurt almost as much as the laughter. Then, across the room, I found my mother's gaze. She was standing near a floral arrangement, her hands clenched tightly around her small evening bag. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar look of horror and helplessness. I could see the pain she felt for me, a silent scream trapped behind her perfectly applied lipstick. But she was frozen, a beautiful statue in a prison of her own making. She wouldn't move, wouldn't speak, wouldn't dare to cross him, not even for her son. Her love was a silent, powerless thing, a ghost in the machine of our family. Seeing her trapped there just as I was, I felt a strange pang of pity for her, which was quickly swallowed by my own hardening resolve. My father, having delivered his verdict, turned his back on me. The show was over. He clapped one of his friends on the shoulder and seamlessly resumed his conversation about market projections, his voice once again booming with confidence and authority. I was dismissed, erased. It was as if I had never spoken, as if I wasn't even there. The circle closed, leaving me on the outside, a ghost at my own father's party. I stood there for another 10 seconds, completely still, letting the finality of the moment wash over me. The humiliation was complete. The ties were severed. He had finally made it clear beyond any shadow of a doubt that I had no place in his world. And for the first time I realized I didn't want one. Without a word, I turned and began the long walk back to the edge of the room. I could feel the lingering stares on my back, but they didn't matter anymore. Each step was deliberate, measured. I wasn't running away. I was retreating to regroup. The boy who had walked up to his father seeking a blessing had been annihilated. In his place was a man with a singular, ice-cold purpose. I wasn't joining the army to prove him wrong. I was joining the army to prove myself right. I would not just survive. I would excel. I would build a life so far removed from his world of inherited wealth and hollow prestige that his opinion would become nothing more than a faint, irrelevant echo from a past I no longer belonged to. That walk out of the ballroom was the first step of my new life. I didn't stop to say goodbye to my mother. I didn't even glance back. I walked straight out the grand entrance, past the valets parking Porsches and Bentleys, and got into my sputtering old sedan. As I drove away from the country club, leaving the warm glow of the party behind, I didn't feel sadness or self-pity. I felt a strange, liberating calm. The weight of his expectations, a burden I had carried my entire life, had finally been lifted. He had tried to break me, but all he had done was set me free. The road ahead was uncertain and would surely be difficult, but it was mine. For the first time, it was completely and totally mine. The drive back to the mansion was a blur. The winding Connecticut roads were dark, lit only by my headlights cutting through the night. Inside my head, though, everything was crystal clear. My father's booming laugh echoed, but it was losing its power with every mile I put between myself and that party. It was no longer a sound that could hurt me. It was just noise, the dying embers of a fire I was finally walking away from. The shame I'd felt in that ballroom was burning off, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I wasn't running from him. I was running towards something, anything that was real. The decision to enlist, once a desperate grasp for purpose, now felt like the most logical, sane choice I had ever made in my entire life. Pulling up the long driveway, the house looked like a mausoleum. The lights were on, casting long, imposing shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn, but it felt completely lifeless. It was a beautiful prison, and I had just been handed the key. I parked my old sedan next to Michael's gleaming Mercedes, a final stark reminder of the world I was leaving behind. I didn't even flinch at the comparison anymore. It was just a thing, a piece of metal. It held no power over me. I walked through the massive front doors, the silence inside a stark contrast to the cacophony of the party. The air was thick with the smell of old money and unspoken resentment. I ignored it all and headed straight for the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. My room felt small, but it was a sanctuary. For the first time, it didn't feel like a place of exile, but a launching pad. I grabbed an old duffel bag from the back of my closet and started packing with a strange sense of efficiency. I didn't pack my sketchbooks or my paints. I packed 3 t-shirts, a couple pairs of jeans, socks, and the few $100 in cash I had saved up. I was shedding my old skin, and it was surprisingly easy. As I was zipping up the bag, the door creaked open. My mother stood there, her face a mess of conflicting emotions. Fear, sorrow, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Pride. She didn't say a word, just stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind her. She walked over to me, her movements hesitant, as if she was afraid my father might materialize out of thin air. Her eyes were red, and I knew she had been crying. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small tarnished silver box. She pressed it into my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "This was your grandfather's," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He wore it in the war." "Your father?" He never understood him either. I opened the box. Inside were a pair of old worn dog tags. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a connection to a legacy my father had tried to erase, a silent acknowledgement that I wasn't the first man in this family to choose a different path. It was her blessing, her small act of defiance. With the dog tags clutched in my hand, I took one last look around the room. My gaze fell on a shelf filled with art books and a few framed sketches I'd done years ago. I saw a small trophy from a high school art competition, tucked away behind a stack of books, because my father had called it a meaningless trinket. For years, these things had defined me. They were the evidence of the son he never wanted. Now they just looked like artifacts from another person's life. There was no sadness, no nostalgia. It was just over. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were an archaeologist examining the ruins of a forgotten civilization. This wasn't me anymore. The real me was in that duffel bag, ready to go. Just as my mother was about to say something else, the door opened again, this time without a knock. Michael stood there, leaning against the frame, a look of condescending pity on his face. He was still in his party suit, looking every bit the heir apparent. "So you're really going through with this little tantrum?" he asked, his voice smooth and mocking. "You're going to throw away a life of comfort, a future in the family business, all because Dad hurt your feelings? Grow up, Ethan, you're being pathetic." His words were meant to cut, to put me back in my place the way they always had. But this time they just glanced off the new armor I was wearing. They were his words from his world, and they had no meaning in mine. I turned to face him fully, my expression unreadable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I just looked him straight in the eye. "This has nothing to do with you, Michael," I said, my voice calm and steady. "And it's not a tantrum. It's my life." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was used to me flinching, arguing, or retreating into silence. He wasn't prepared for this quiet, unshakable resolve. He opened his mouth to say something else, a sarcastic retort already forming on his lips, but he stopped. He saw it then. He saw that the dynamic had shifted. that the younger brother he'd always seen as weak and insignificant was gone. He just shook his head and walked away, leaving me alone with my mother. My mother gave my hand one last squeeze, tears welling in her eyes again. "Be safe," she whispered, a universe of unsaid words packed into that simple phrase. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I hugged her, a real hug, maybe the first one in years, and then I walked out of my room for the last time. I walked down the grand, curving staircase, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The family portraits lining the wall seemed to watch me go. There was my father, stern and powerful. There was Michael, smirking with a tennis racket. And there was me, a small, awkward boy with sad eyes. I didn't feel like that boy anymore. I was walking out of the frame, out of the story they had written for me. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw him. My father was in his study, the door wide open. He was standing by the mahogany bar, pouring himself another glass of whiskey, his back to me. He must have heard my footsteps on the marble floor, because he stopped and slowly turned around. Our eyes met across the vast, silent foyer. His face was a mask of cold fury and disappointment. There was no remorse, no regret, just the icy certainty that he was right and I was a fool. I held his gaze, not with defiance, but with a quiet finality. I gave him a single slow nod. It wasn't a sign of respect or surrender. It was a goodbye. He turned his back without a word and took a long drink from his glass. I walked out the front door and didn't look back. The night air was cool and clean. I tossed my bag onto the passenger seat of my old car, the engine groaning to life with a familiar sputter. As I drove down the long tree-lined driveway, I glanced at the mansion in my rearview mirror just once. It looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. It was just a house, a collection of stone and glass filled with unhappy people. I turned onto the main road, heading toward the highway, toward a future that was completely unknown and terrifyingly real. For the first time, I wasn't driving away from something. I was driving toward myself, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I would never, ever be back. The 6 years that followed were a lifetime. The army took the soft, uncertain boy from Connecticut and systematically broke him down, then rebuilt him from the ground up. Basic training was a crucible, a relentless furnace that burned away every last trace of my old life. The calluses on my hands replaced the charcoal stains under my fingernails. The quiet anxiety that had been my constant companion was replaced by a steely, watchful calm forged in the deserts of Afghanistan and the jungles of places my father couldn't even find on a map. I wasn't the artistic son anymore. I was a soldier, then a leader. I found a new family, a brotherhood bound not by blood and money but by shared hardship, mutual respect and absolute trust. They didn't care about my last name or the size of my father's bank account. They cared if I could carry my weight, if I had their back. And I did, every single day. The notification arrived on a standard military letterhead, unassuming and direct. It informed me that I was to be awarded a medal for distinguished service, a commendation for a mission whose details would remain classified for years to come. The ceremony was to be held at the Pentagon. My first reaction wasn't pride, not in the way my father would understand it. It was a deep, quiet satisfaction. It was an acknowledgement from the only world that mattered to me now, a world where your worth was measured by your actions, not your inheritance. It was a validation earned through sweat, fear, and sacrifice. For a fleeting moment, I thought about the boy who desperately wanted a nod of approval for a painting, and I felt a strange sense of pity for him. He had been looking for respect in all the wrong places. A week later, the formal packet arrived. It contained the official invitation, travel orders, and a schedule of events. Tucked inside was a list of dignitaries and special guests who would be in attendance. I scanned it idly, my eyes glazing over the names of senators, four-star generals, and corporate titans who supported military initiatives. Then my breath caught in my throat. My eyes locked on a name halfway down the second page. Mr. Richard Miller, CEO, Miller Industries. It felt like a punch to the gut. The world I had built for myself, a world so completely separate from him, was about to collide with the past I had fought so hard to escape. The ghost from the ballroom was about to be in the front row of the most important day of my professional life. For about an hour, I was thrown back into that old chaos. The anger, the humiliation, the sting of his laughter, it all came rushing back, a tidal wave of memory. My first instinct was to find a way out. I could feign illness, claim a scheduling conflict, anything to avoid that confrontation. The thought of seeing his face, of having him there in that sacred space, felt like a violation. But as the initial shock subsided, the soldier in me took over. The cold, hard resolve that had gotten me through hell and back settled in my chest. I had not endured everything I had just to run from a ghost. This ceremony wasn't about him. It was about my men, my service, and the honor I had earned. I would not let his presence diminish it. I would not give him that power. I would go. The days leading up to the ceremony were spent in meticulous preparation. I took out my dress uniform, the deep green fabric a world away from the cheap suit I'd worn that night. Every detail had to be perfect. I spent hours polishing my shoes until I could see my own hardened reflection in the black leather. I carefully pinned each medal and ribbon onto the jacket, each one representing a chapter of my life he knew nothing about. There was the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the row of campaign ribbons. This uniform wasn't a costume. It was my history. It was the skin I had earned. Unlike the suits he and Michael wore, symbols of a life they were handed, this uniform was a testament to a life I had built with my own 2 hands. It fit me perfectly because I had become the man who deserved to wear it. I decided to call my mother. We had maintained a fragile, infrequent line of communication over the years, short, careful calls where we talked about everything and nothing. I told her about the award, keeping my voice steady and professional. I didn't mention my father's name. I didn't want to put her in that impossible position. Her reaction was immediate and emotional, a flood of relief and pride that came through the phone in a choked sob. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I'm so proud of you. Your grandfather, he would have been so proud." Hearing her say his name, the grandfather who had also served the man my father had dismissed as a failure, was like a final seal of approval. It was the only blessing I had ever needed. The night before the ceremony, I was in a sterile hotel room in Arlington, Virginia. Sleep was impossible. The city lights glowed outside the window, but my mind was 1,000 miles away, replaying scenarios. I pictured seeing him in the crowd. What would his face look like? Would he even recognize me? I imagined him trying to speak to me afterward, his hand outstretched, a forced smile on his face. What would I say? The old me would have rehearsed a cutting speech, a litany of every grievance. But the man I was now found the idea of a verbal confrontation to be pointless. Words were his weapon, not mine. I realized I didn't need to say anything at all. My presence on that stage, in that uniform, would say everything that ever needed to be said. My life was the rebuttal. The next morning I put on the uniform. It felt heavy with the weight of responsibility and honor. As I drove toward the Pentagon, the sheer scale of the building was awe-inspiring. It was a fortress, a symbol of the nation I had sworn to protect. It was a world of order, discipline, and purpose, everything my family's chaotic world of emotional manipulation was not. Walking through its long, hallowed corridors, past portraits of military heroes and flags representing generations of service, my own personal drama felt infinitesimally small. A sense of profound calm settled over me. I wasn't Ethan Miller, the disappointing son walking into a confrontation. I was Captain Miller, United States Army, reporting for duty. My purpose was clear. I was escorted backstage to a staging area with the other honorees. The air was thick with a quiet mutual respect. We were a collection of men and women from every branch of service, our uniforms a patchwork of colors and traditions. But we were bound by a common code. We exchanged quiet nods and firm handshakes. No one boasted. No one needed to. We could hear the muffled sounds of the auditorium filling up, the low hum of hundreds of voices, the introductory music starting to play. I knew he was out there somewhere, taking his seat in the VIP section, probably adjusting his $1,000 tie and shaking hands with a senator. The thought barely registered. My focus was on the here and now, on the men standing beside me. An aide came by and gave us our final instructions, running through the sequence of events. He read our names aloud to confirm the order. "And then Captain Ethan Miller." He looked at me and I nodded. The name sounded solid, real. It belonged to me. A bell chimed, signaling 5 minutes until the start of the ceremony. The chatter backstage died down. We all stood a little straighter, our expressions settling into a practiced, professional neutrality. I took a slow, deep breath, the way I'd been trained to do before a breach. I could feel the familiar thrum of adrenaline, but it was controlled, focused. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. Doors to the stage were about to open, and I was about to walk into the light, not for him, but for me. The lights in the auditorium were warm and bright, casting a reverent glow over the rows of distinguished guests. The Secretary of Defense was at the podium, his voice a steady, deep cadence that filled the vast silent space. I stood backstage listening to the muffled words, my focus narrowed to a fine point. The weight of my dress uniform was a familiar comfort, a constant reminder of the man I had become. The nervous boy from Greenwich was a distant memory, a ghost from another life. In this moment there was only the mission: walk onto that stage, accept the honor on behalf of my men, and represent the uniform I wore. My father wasn't even a thought in my mind. He belonged to a world that had ceased to exist for me. The announcer began calling the first names. One by one, men and women I deeply respected walked across the stage to a thunderous, heartfelt applause. A Marine sergeant who had pulled 3 of his men from a burning vehicle under heavy fire. A Navy SEAL who had held a position alone for 12 hours, against impossible odds. I listened to their citations, each a testament to a level of courage that defied easy description. This was my new family, my tribe. The sense of belonging I felt here among these quiet heroes was more profound than anything I had ever known in the cold, cavernous rooms of my father's mansion. This was a place where value was measured in deeds, not dollars, and I had finally found my home. An aide-de-camp, a young lieutenant with sharp professional eyes, caught my gaze and gave me a crisp final nod. It was almost my turn. I instinctively straightened my jacket, the fabric stiff and formal, and ran a hand over the neat row of ribbons on my chest. My heart rate was steady, a practiced calm I had learned to master in situations far more stressful than this, but a low thrum of adrenaline, a familiar electric current began to flow through me. The announcer's voice was getting closer, moving down the list with a deliberate, respectful pace. The sound echoed slightly in the backstage area, each syllable carrying the weight of history and honor. The world outside this small, dim space seemed to fade away. Through a small gap in the heavy velvet curtain, I caught a fleeting glimpse of the audience. It was a sea of faces, a blur of decorated uniforms and dark, expensive suits. I made a conscious decision not to scan the front row, not to search for him. To do so would be to give him power over this moment, and I had sworn to myself that I would never give him that power again. Instead, I fixed my gaze on the massive American flag that hung behind the podium, its stars and stripes illuminated by the stage lights. It was my anchor, the symbol of the country I served, the ideal that had given my life a purpose far greater than myself. It was all that mattered. Then the moment arrived. The announcer's deep baritone voice resonated through the auditorium, clear and strong. And now for extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in a combat zone. The United States Army is immensely proud to present its highest award for valor to a leader of exceptional courage, Captain Ethan Miller. The name echoed my name, followed by a beat of respectful silence before the applause began to swell, a rising tide of sound that seemed to shake the very floor beneath my feet. This was it. The aide opened the curtain, and a path of bright light unfolded before me. It was time to walk into that light. I exhaled slowly and stepped forward, moving from the shadows into the full, brilliant glare of the stage. The applause was a physical force, a wave of respect from hundreds of people who knew nothing of my past but understood the meaning of the uniform I wore. My steps were measured and even, my back ramrod straight, my chin up. My eyes were locked on the 4-star general standing at the center of the stage, the man who would present the medal. Every ounce of my training took over, pushing aside any lingering personal emotion. In that moment, I was not a son, not a brother. I was an officer in the United States Army, walking forward to accept an honor earned in blood and sacrifice. As I reached my mark and executed a sharp, precise salute to the general, my training allowed for a brief, sweeping glance across the VIP section, and my eyes found him. He was sitting exactly where I'd known he would be, wedged between a powerful senator and the CEO of a major defense contractor. But the man I saw was not the imposing titan who had haunted my youth. He looked old and surprisingly small in his perfectly tailored suit. His face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on me as if he were seeing an apparition. The arrogant, dismissive smirk I knew so well was gone, replaced by a look of utter, profound disbelief. The announcer began reading my citation aloud, the formal language painting a stark picture of a mission gone wrong in the mountains of Afghanistan. The words described a prolonged firefight, a critical decision under pressure, the lives of my men hanging in the balance. I stood at perfect attention, but my mind was a dual processor. One part was here on this stage, a soldier receiving a commendation. The other was watching my father's entire worldview shatter in real time. I could almost see the gears in his head grinding, failing to reconcile the image of the artist, the waste of time, with the decorated captain being lauded for valor by the nation's highest military leaders. The sound of his laughter from that party 6 years ago was a faint, pathetic echo, a sound from a different world, about a different man. My gaze flickered for a second to the man sitting beside him, Michael. His reaction was a mirror of our father's shock, but with an added layer of dawning, horrified comprehension. His usual air of smug superiority had evaporated, leaving behind a pale, bewildered man. He looked from me on the stage to our father, and back again as if the very laws of physics had been broken. The expensive Rolex on his wrist caught the stage light, but it seemed dull, meaningless. All the symbols of their power, the cars, the watches, the country club memberships, were exposed for what they were, hollow props in a world that had no currency here. He finally saw that I was playing a different game, one where his rules meant absolutely nothing. The general stepped forward and carefully pinned the medal onto the breast of my uniform. The metal was heavy and cool, a solid, tangible weight against my chest. He grasped my hand in a firm, powerful grip, leaned in and said, "We're all damn proud of you, son." The applause from the audience surged again, a deafening roar of approval. I saluted the general one last time, turned and faced the crowd. And then I did it. I looked directly at my father. Our eyes met across the brightly lit expanse. The shock in his eyes was now warring with a storm of other emotions. I saw shame. I saw confusion. I saw a deep, gut-wrenching bewilderment. And then, for just a fleeting second, I saw something I never ever expected to see, a flicker of awe, a glimmer of what might have been pride. In that final silent exchange, I felt a profound and surprising emptiness. The rage was gone. The hurt was gone. The desperate, lifelong craving for his validation had vanished as if it had never been there at all. It was like looking at a stranger, a relic from a past that no longer had any claim on me. His opinion was irrelevant. I hadn't done this for him. I had done this for me, for my men, for the man I had forced myself to become. I gave the audience a single respectful nod, turned with military precision, and walked off the stage, leaving him behind in the crowd. I didn't need to hear him say he was wrong. I didn't need his apology. My life was my closing statement. The war was over, and I had won. The reception afterwards was held in a high-ceilinged hall adorned with military flags and portraits of stern-faced generals. The air was thick with the smell of catered food and the low, respectful hum of conversation. I was surrounded by men I considered brothers, officers I admired, their handshakes firm, their congratulations sincere. For the first time in my life, I felt completely at ease in a room full of powerful people, because here, power was earned. The general who had pinned the medal on my chest was telling me a story about his own first tour, when a young aide approached me discreetly. "Captain Miller," he said in a low voice, "your family is waiting for you in the marshal room." I knew this moment was coming. I nodded, excused myself, and felt the familiar cold calm settle over me as I walked toward the designated room. The battle was over, but the terms of surrender still needed to be signed. When I opened the heavy oak door, my mother was the only one inside. She stood by the window, looking out at the manicured lawns of the Pentagon grounds, wringing her hands the same way she always did when she was nervous. The moment she saw me, her face crumpled, and she rushed forward, throwing her arms around me. She held on tight, her body shaking with silent sobs. She wasn't just hugging me, she was clinging to me, as if to make up for 6 years of silent, helpless distance. She pulled back, her hands framing my face, her eyes scanning every inch of me as if to confirm I was real. "Look at you," she whispered, her voice choked with a pride she had never been allowed to express. Her trembling fingers reached out and gently touched the medal on my chest. "Oh, Ethan, just look at you." It was the only validation I had ever truly needed. The door opened again and Michael stepped in, looking profoundly out of place. His expensive suit, which would have looked powerful in a boardroom, seemed like a cheap costume in this building. He shifted his weight, avoiding my eyes, his usual smug confidence completely gone. "Ethan," he started, his voice strained and unfamiliar. "That was quite something. Congratulations." It was the most awkward, stilted sentence I had ever heard him utter. He was a man whose entire identity was built on being the favored son, the heir to the throne. Now the throne looked like a cheap piece of furniture, and the brother he'd dismissed was being honored by generals. I just nodded politely. "Thank you, Michael." There was nothing else to say. The chasm between us was no longer just about our father's approval. It was a fundamental difference in the way we saw the world. We were strangers who happened to share the same last name. Then my father appeared, filling the doorway. He didn't come all the way into the room, just stood on the threshold, a silent, imposing figure. But the imposition was gone. He looked smaller, older. His eyes, which had always been sharp and critical, were now filled with a deep, unsettling confusion. He looked at my uniform, at the rows of ribbons, at the medal, and then finally at my face. It was as if he was trying to solve a complex equation that his brain refused to compute. The man who always had a booming opinion, a cutting remark, a dismissive laugh, was utterly silent. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with 6 years of unspoken words. I watched him waiting, not with anticipation, but with a detached, clinical curiosity. I wondered what a man like him does when his entire reality has been so thoroughly and publicly dismantled. He finally cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He took a hesitant step forward, his gaze still locked on the medal. "Ethan," he said, his voice raspy, stripped of its usual authority, "you've made your point." He paused, as if searching for the right words, but the only language he knew was that of business, of transactions. "There's a place for you at Miller Industries, a senior executive position. Your discipline, your leadership. It would be an asset. It's time to come home." The offer hung in the air, a stunningly tone-deaf gesture. He was trying to buy me back, to absorb my success into his world, to make it something he could understand and control. He still didn't get it. He never would. He saw my uniform not as a symbol of service, but as a resume for a corporate job. I didn't feel anger or resentment. For the first time, looking at this powerful man, who had cast such a long and damaging shadow over my life, I felt a pang of something close to pity. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, unable to comprehend any value that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. I gave him a small, sad smile. "Thank you for the offer, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "But I already have a home." I didn't need to elaborate. My meaning was clear in the uniform I wore, in the way I stood, in the calm certainty in my eyes. My home was with the men I served with, in the country I had sworn to protect. It was a world built on a code of honor he would never understand. My life was not a phase to be outgrown. It was the foundation upon which I had built myself. His face fell. The last flicker of hope, the hope that he could still pull me back into his orbit and reclaim control, died in his eyes. He seemed to shrink right there in the doorway. For a man like him, my quiet, respectful rejection was a more devastating blow than any shouted accusation could ever be. It was a final, undeniable confirmation that his money, his influence, his entire world, held no power over me anymore. He gave a single, slow, defeated nod. He turned without another word and walked away down the long, empty corridor. Michael, after a moment of stunned hesitation, shot me one last unreadable look and followed him, a loyal second-in-command to a king who had just lost his kingdom. My mother stayed, and for the first time she didn't look back to see where her husband was going. Years passed. I stayed in the army, eventually making major. I got married, had 2 kids, and bought a small house near Fort Bragg, a life that was completely, wonderfully ordinary and entirely my own. I spoke to my mother every week. She told me the news from home in small, careful doses. My father had sold Miller Industries to a larger conglomerate. He had retired, but retirement didn't suit him. He rattled around the giant Greenwich mansion like a ghost, his health slowly failing, the silence of the big house a constant companion. Michael was given a mid-level management position in the new company, a respectable job, but a far cry from the CEO title he had been groomed for his entire life. The empire was gone, replaced by a quiet, lingering emptiness. They still had all the money in the world, but they had lost everything that mattered. Sometimes, late at night when my own house is quiet, I'll walk into my study. On the bookshelf, next to photos of my wife and kids, is a simple wooden frame. Inside is a picture of my unit, a group of tired, dusty men smiling in the Afghan sun. Beside it sits another frame, this one holding an old, black and white photo of my grandfather in his army uniform from World War II. Resting in front of it are his tarnished dog tags, the ones my mother gave me that night. I look at those two photos, at the legacy of service that my father tried so hard to erase, and I feel a profound sense of peace. I didn't destroy his world. He did. I just chose to build my own, and it was the best decision I ever made. If you know someone who feels trapped or undervalued, someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't defined by others, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about forging your own path, even when it's the hardest one to walk. Thank you for listening. Looking back on it all, the biggest lesson I learned wasn't about fathers and sons, or about proving someone wrong. It was about where we look for our own value. For so many years I was like a man dying of thirst, begging for a single drop of water from a well that had been dry my entire life. I was looking for approval from the one person who was fundamentally incapable of giving it. The real turning point wasn't when I joined the army. It was when I finally stopped asking. It was when I realized that my self-worth wasn't something he could grant or withhold, like a weekly allowance. It was something I had to build myself from the ground up, in a place where his opinion couldn't reach. And that's a truth that applies to any cage someone else has built for you, whether it's made of gold or just criticism. The quiet victory in life isn't about making the people who hurt you finally admit they were wrong. Trust me, you could wait a lifetime for that and it may never come. The real victory is making their opinion of you completely and totally irrelevant. It's about taking all that energy you spend trying to convince them, trying to make them see you and turning it inward. You use that energy to build your own house brick by painful brick. You focus on your own code, your own standards, your own definition of success. When you do that, something incredible happens. Their voices start to fade. The laughter, the insults, the dismissive sighs. They just become noise from a distant room you no longer live in. You're not fighting them anymore. You're just too busy building your own life to even notice they're still watching. I also learned what real strength looks like. In my father's world, strength was loud. It was a new Mercedes, a booming voice in a boardroom, a Rolex on your wrist. It was about showing everyone how powerful you were. But the strongest people I've ever met, the men I served with, their strength was quiet. It was in their discipline when they were exhausted, their courage when they were terrified, and their unwavering loyalty to the person standing next to them. It wasn't something they wore or drove. It was something they carried inside them. It was a strength forged in fire, not bought in a showroom. It's the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience, because it's not a performance. It's just who you are down to the bone. And that brings me to the idea of home. For most of my life, I thought home was that giant cold mansion in Connecticut. But it was never a home. It was just a house. I learned that home isn't about the four walls you sleep between. It's about finding your tribe. It's about finding the people who see you, respect you, and have your back, no questions asked. For me, that was the army. It was a brotherhood built on shared struggle and mutual respect. You might find your home in a different place, in a passion, in a community, in a family you choose for yourself. The important thing is to recognize when the place you were born is no longer the place you belong. Leaving is hard, but sometimes it's the only way to finally come home to yourself. The most powerful statements we make in life are often silent. I spent years imagining a big confrontation with my father, a scene where I'd list every wrong, every insult, and finally have my say. But when the moment came, I realized I didn't need it. My life had become my closing argument. The uniform I wore, the medal on my chest, the quiet confidence in my own skin, that said everything that ever needed to be said. Your character, your integrity, the life you build when no one is looking, that is your truth. You don't have to shout it from the rooftops. You just have to live it. A life lived with purpose and honor is a message that echoes louder and longer than any angry words ever could. So I want you to think about your own life for a second. Who holds the key to your self-worth? Who are you trying to get that drop of water from? It might be a parent, a boss, a partner, or even just that critical voice inside your own head. The most courageous thing you can ever do is gently take that key back and put it in your own pocket. It's terrifying to walk away from the familiar, even when the familiar is hurting you. But I promise you, on the other side of that fear is a sense of freedom you can't even imagine. It's the freedom to finally stop auditioning for a role in someone else's story and start writing your own. My story isn't really about the military or about a rich family. It's about the universal fight to become the person you were meant to be, especially when the world or even your own family tells you that person isn't good enough. It's about finding a purpose so strong that it becomes your armor against the doubts of others. Your path will be your own, and it won't be easy, but it will be yours. And building a life that is truly yours is the only victory that really matters in the end. It's a long, hard road, but it's the only one that leads back to yourself.